you may have noticed in the syllabus that we had a week set aside for a midterm review. And looking at my roster of students, as far as I can tell, none of you are taking this class for credit. And that being the case, there's no point in a midterm review because there's no midterm. So that's why we have continued to just plow on through the text rather than take that week, which would have been last week or the week before, for midterm review. So that's the explanation of that. If I am mistaken, if my records are mistaken and somebody is intending to take this class for credit, please let me know and we'll remedy that. By the way, if you are taking this class for credit, you owe me some sermon outlines. I haven't seen any, so that's part of my assumption. So take your Bible, turn to 2 Kings chapter 14. We had left off last time talking about King Ahaziah. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoaz, the son of Joash, begins to reign 25 years old. He's 29, he reigns for 29 years. And on balance, he is a good king. You find the parallel over in 2 Chronicles chapter 25. Now, among other things, Ahaziah, though he is by and large a righteous king, Ahaziah does some not smart things. He hired 100,000 mercenaries from the king to the north, from Israel, and then when he was scolded about it, dismissed them without taking them to battle. We wound up last week talking about the fact that the 100,000 mercenaries went home naturally through the territory of Judah and plundered cities and villages in Judah in their anger or in their frustration at not being taken into battle. One of the things to keep in mind is that part of the reason for mercenaries being mercenaries is the prospect of profit. They're professional soldiers. They didn't fight because the king of Israel sent them or lent them to Ahaziah. They fought because they were hired to fight. And so they went into Judah's territory with the expectation that they were going to go with Judah's army of 300,000, go up against Edom, fight against Edom, despoil Edom, take spoils and plunder and make a profit. When that didn't happen, they were understandably pretty upset. And so they took out their frustration on the people who hired and then fired them, which is the cities and villages of Judah. God had, through the prophets, instructed Ahaziah, you send them home. This hiring them is a gesture of you not trusting me, and you need to trust me. Now, Ahaziah does defeat the Edomites. Over in 2 Chronicles chapter 25, in verse 12, they're identified as Petra. This is the area. If you've seen the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade movie, the red cliffs where the city is carved into the cliffs, that's a real place. That's not CGI in the movies. That is a place called Petra, and that was part of the territory of Edom. It dates back to that era. And so Judah was victorious. But now, come down and look at verses 8 and following. It says, verse 7, he struck down 10,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt, took Selah by storm, called it Yokthiel. And then he sent messengers to Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, king of Israel. All right, let's get together. Let's look one another in the face. And of course, Jehoash is not too cordial. I think this is where we had basically left off last time. A thistle on Lebanon sent to a cedar. And we see in his reply what Amaziah's purpose was. He was proposing to arrange a marriage between their children. That would have been, on one level, a possible prelude to reuniting the kingdom. that would have been, had they not reunited the kingdom, at least a way of combining the royal houses of both nations so that they would ensure a lineage to both nations. But the response basically is, you're a nobody. You have nothing to brag about. And the response may be in part because of the way that the mercenaries had been treated. Who are you? You hired my army, you hired soldiers from me, and then sent them home without using them. You're a nobody. You have struck down Edom and you think you're a big shot. Just go home and be happy that you had that little victory. Go back to verse 7, 10,000 Edomites. Now, of all the multiplied thousands that Ahaziah had put together, that doesn't sound like a particularly big casualty count. But then again, Edom was not a particularly big nation. They were a well-fortified nation. Go over to Obadiah, read the little one-chapter book of Obadiah, and one of the things that Obadiah points out is that Edom's trust, Edom's ego, was based on their geography. They're in the cleft of the rock. They're in a very defensible position. If you are acquainted with the Greek tragedy of the 300 and how the 300 stopped up a narrow defile between the rocks so that the army of the Persians couldn't get through, that's the circumstance of the Edomites, or at least as they saw themselves. You couldn't send a whole great big army at them at once because there wasn't enough room. So they thought they were invincible. The fact that Judah defeated them, of course, shows that they're not. But the king of Israel, Jehoash, looks at that as, that's not particularly impressive. They're not that big an army. You haven't won that big a victory. Look down to verse 11, though, and you get a little bit of insight into Ahaziah's character. He's a godly king for the most part. Ahaziah would not listen. So Jehoash, king of Israel, went up. He and Ahaziah, king of Judah, faced one another in battle at Beth Shemesh, that belongs to Judah. And notice what it says here: Judah was defeated by Israel. Well, that's hardly surprising in some ways. Judah is numerically inferior to Israel. Typically, when you see the army of Judah and the army of Israel, whether they're allied together, as in the days of Jehoshaphat and Ahab, or whether they're in opposition to each other, the difference is usually about a 2-to-1 advantage in favor of Israel, which makes sense because Israel is 10 tribes. Judah is 1 and a little bit of Benjamin. Even though Judah is a numerically prosperous tribe, still it's hardly surprising that they would be outnumbered. But notice, we find here Jehoash captures Ahaziah and breaks down the walls of Jerusalem. Ahaziah has to watch as his capital is being invaded, is being rendered insecure now. He broke down the wall 400 cubits, about 600 feet, a little over 1/10 of a mile worth of wall. Can you imagine, how many people and how long it would take to build a city wall that long? That's only about 600 feet. If you've ever built anything of that sort, a fence, a garden wall, something like that, you realize really quickly how long it takes to do that. The more people, the quicker it goes, but still, it's an undertaking. Yes, ma'am.
Judah and Israel, I know how the tribes are split up, but do you think it's like that because, every time Judah won over Israel, it was a big deal because of the size of the tribe, but it showed God's power every time.
Mm-hmm.
It showed all the time that God was fighting for them. So is that why the tribes are so,
well, every time Judah wins, it's because God is on their side. But the thing that stands out here is Judah loses.
Yeah.
Why would Judah lose? Why would God allow Judah to lose here?
Is it because he hired?
I don't think it's because I don't think it's because of the mercenaries.
Okay.
Go back and look down here at verse 8 and the succeeding verses, it's Amaziah seemingly that proposes the marriage alliance to Jehoash. And that's, yes, they are kinfolks, they're fellow Israelites, but all of Jehoash's people are what? They're idolaters. They're ungodly. And Amaziah basically is proposing to marry off his son to an ungodly daughter of an ungodly king, and that's not good for Judah. So,
There's always disobedience.
yeah, that's importing disobedience into the heart of Judah. Amaziah is basically an upright king. He's not perfect, but he's certainly better than a lot of them. And yet this is a very foolish move on his part. Now, why does Jehoash resist that? Why does he offer battle instead of an alliance when this is proposed? Any ideas? Well, look at what he does in verse 14. He seized all the gold and silver and the vessels in the house of the Lord, in the treasuries of the king's house, took hostages, and returned to Samaria. Now, think about Jehoash's circumstances on the world stage. He's got Judah on his southern border, and militarily, Judah is, unless God fights for them, Judah is not a big threat, and Judah doesn't seem particularly to have any designs on Israel other than let's marry our kids together. But who's on his northern border? Yeah, the Syrians are up here to the north. And in addition, farther to the east are the Assyrians and the Babylonians, all the ancient cultures around the rest of the Fertile Crescent, and they're more powerful than he is. Who is on his border to the west over here along the Mediterranean coast? You've got the Sidonians, who have had strong influence in Israel. Just think about Jezebel. And to their south, you've got the Philistines, who are a Phoenician type people also. So he's surrounded. The Philistines and the Sidonians are not necessarily a big threat to him unless they ally with the Syrians. But it does him no good from a political point of view to forge an alliance with Judah. Plus, you got those 100,000 disgruntled soldiers to deal with. So that may be an added aspect of this. You come down to verse 15, you have the end of Jehoash's reign. The rest of his acts, his might, how he fought with Amaziah, that's all recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And he died. That's the end of Jehoash. And he is replaced by Jeroboam II, a second king named Jeroboam. I think maybe we talked about this a little bit last week as we were covering some of this. But the thing that stands out here is that we look at this and say, what kind of person would name a child Jeroboam? Well, in Israel, that name didn't have a bad connotation. Jeroboam, the original Jeroboam, was the founder of their national religion, Dan and Bethel, the priesthood that they engaged in. When they purged out, when they got rid of the worship of the Baalim and the Asherah, what did they go back to? They didn't go back to God in Israel. They went back to the idols that Jeroboam had created. So they went back to their national religion.
Hey,
yes.
Where do you place the Hittite kingdom? Because at one time I thought it was in the north. And then when you're looking at Abraham in Genesis, it seems to indicate they're in the land of Canaan.
Yes.
So it seems like there's some discrepancy in some of the maps, drawings of them being up.
Okay, question. Where do the Hittites come in all of this, going back to the days of the Exodus? down through the Judges and Joshua drove the Hittites out of the land. The Hittites did occupy a part of the land of promise. The Hittite Empire, and there was a Hittite empire, though scholars of 100 years ago scoffed at the idea. There has been archaeological evidence of it uncovered since then. As best I recall, the Hittite Empire largely was up more to the north, above the area that the Syrians occupied. But evidently their influence was quite powerful for their time. We could, after the break, I'll try to bring up a map or two, and after the break, we'll take a look at that. But they were still in existence, obviously, but the Syrians had overcome their influence at this point. So Jehoash of Israel dies. Jeroboam II becomes king in his place. And then we come to the death of Ahaziah. Ahaziah lived 15 years after Jehoash. So he has 29 years. It's during the first half of his reign that he is kind of wanting to play footsie with Jehoash. And so after Jehoash dies, Jeroboam becomes the king. Ahaziah lives 15 more years, and there's not much else said about Ahaziah at this point. His dealings, his doing. Notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 25, as you look at the parallel here, 2 Chronicles 25, 26, 27, and 28, the last three verses. The rest of the acts of Ahaziah. Now notice at verse 27 in 2 Chronicles 25. From the time that Ahaziah did turn away from following the Lord, they made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem, but he fled to Lachish. They sent after him to Lachish and slew him there and brought him upon horses and buried him with his fathers in the city of Judah. So here's a very unusual experience in Judah. Ahaziah is assassinated. That's pretty common in Israel, but not in Judah. And in Judah, they bring the body back and they bury him in the tomb of his fathers. They made a conspiracy against him. Why do you suppose? Why would they conspire against Ahaziah? He starts out, he's a good king.
They lie. I guess they had to lie on him.
Well, notice what it says about him. He turned away from following the Lord. That's Chronicles gives us the little tidbit of information that Kings does not. Kings tells us they made a conspiracy and chased him to Lachish and murdered him. Chronicles tells us why. Somewhere in there, he turned away from God. It's rare that you find an unrighteous king turning to God. It's not as rare that you find a righteous man turning away from God. What that really testifies to is what?
It's hard to be righteous.
It's hard to be righteous. It testifies to the power of temptation. And for a man in Amaziah's position, maybe it testifies to the power of ego. When you're the king, life is good when you're the king, until you begin to believe your own press. Go ahead, Brother Benji.
And then opening the door with wanting his son to marry the daughter.
Yeah, that's our first little inkling, isn't it? Well, really not our first little inkling, the hiring those mercenaries, not trusting God, but then trying to have an alliance with an ungodly kingdom. That doesn't sound good, does it?
Yeah, they say it's not that you immediately just turn and walk away from God, but it's a process.
Yeah.
You can see that with him.
Yeah. You know, there is an older preacher made an observation some years ago that has really stuck with me, and I have seen it repeated again and again in my own lifetime. This is particularly true in the life of congregations, where someone will make a proposal. Let's do ABC. Let's change the way we're doing this and that and do it some other way. And some old gray-headed brother will rear up in the back of the men's business meeting or the auditorium or whatnot and say, brother, that's not wise to do that. That opens the door to things that are not good. Well, but it's not unscriptural, brother. So we're going to do it. Well, down the road we go. And somebody says, well, let's do DEF. An old gray-haired brother, brethren, it's not wise. Well, but it's not unscriptural and we like it, so we're going to do it. And this goes on and goes on and goes on, where it's not unscriptural, but we like it, so we're going to do it. And finally, you get down to XYZ, and old brother gray hair back here says, brethren, that's unscriptural. Book, chapter, and verse, here's why it's wrong. And what happens? We have set a precedent of, it may not be wise, but we like it, so we're going to do it. So now when it's not scriptural, well, but we like it, we're going to do it. And that's exactly what we see transpire in Amaziah's life, isn't it? He doesn't trust the Lord in dealing with the Edomites. He tries to do it on his own and gets scolded and basically kind of swatted down by God and then vindicated. God vindicates himself. They're triumphant over the Edomites.
I thought you were going to say about apostasy, it's not one giant leap
No.
from bad to good, from good to bad. Apostasy is small steps.
Apostasy is geometry.
Yeah.
Apostasy is geometry. When you take a ray in geometry and it goes this way, you start from this point, and I may be using the wrong term. It's been 50 years since I studied geometry. When you deviate from that ray, you're not very far off right here. But the farther you go, what happens? The farther away you get. You're not very far away right here. You're farther away right here. But if you keep going this way, look how far you are right here. Small steps on a long journey. So Amaziah, step by step, turned away from God. What was the straw that broke the camel's back for his people, that they would chase him to Lachish and assassinate him? Doesn't say, except that he turned away from God.
Well, it's good to read the whole counsel.
Yeah.
Because in 2 Kings, it don't say what it said in Chronicles. So
That's right.
a big deal.
Chronicles does give us that little tidbit of information that it's because he turned away from God. But it doesn't tell us what the action was that put them to that point. It just records the fact of it. So they brought him back. The people of Judah took Azariah, his 16-year-old son, and made him king instead of his father Amaziah. And he built Elath and restored it to Judah after the king slept with his fathers. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign. So now we're going to shift the focus back north, and we're going to jump back 16 years. Amaziah still has 16 years to go at this point, and Jeroboam has become the new king in Samaria over Israel. Jeroboam's going to live a long time, 41 years that he reigns. And what do we know about every single solitary king of Israel? They're bad. He was evil just like his fathers, did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, restored the border of Israel from Lebo-Hamath as far as the Sea of the Arabah. So in some respects, there was some seemingly good things about him, recovered some Israelite territory. Notice what it says, though, about this. He restored the border according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel. Spoken by whom? Jonah. Jonah, the son of Amittai, down here in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now you jump over into the minor prophets and you're introduced to Jonah. And what do you know about Jonah in the minor prophets?
He was a coward.
He seemingly was
But he got it right.
I don't know if coward is the right word, but he was certainly a little obstreperous about keeping the Lord's commandment there. It would seem up to this point in the book of Jonah, he was a good, useful, godly prophet. And then God gives him an assignment that he doesn't like, and he tries to run away. The interesting thing is where God sends him. God sends him to Nineveh. Where is Nineveh?
Syrian nation.
Way over by Babylon. Way
Nineveh
over east.
is way over here. It's actually Assyria. Not Syria, but Assyria. And in the days of Jonah, which would correspond right here to the days of Ahaziah and Jeroboam II, Assyria is not yet the world dominating empire that it's going to become. It's a powerful nation, but it's not yet a threat to Israel and Judah the way that Syria is. Syria is closer. Syria exerts more influence. What happens when Jonah preaches in Nineveh? They repented. They repented from the king to the beggar in the streets. 100 years later, in the middle of the 7th century, 600s BC, God is going to send a message to the Assyrians again through the prophet Nahum, only this time they're not going to listen. And what happens then? God raises up the Babylonians to conquer them. But as long as you listen to God, you do good. Things turn out well for you. So we have Jeroboam now, the second Jeroboam on the throne. The reason, why would God allow Jeroboam, goodness, a man with that name who's evil, who perpetuates the sins of his namesake, why would God allow him to have success on the battlefield? Well, look
There's
down.
always disobedience on the other side, right? If he's having success.
Well, there's disobedience on the other side, but he's not being obedient either. Look at verses 26 and 27. The Lord saw the affliction of Israel was very bitter. There was none left, bond or free. There was none to help Israel. But the Lord had said he would not blot out the name of Israel from under heaven. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Jehoash.
It was just convenient.
Jeroboam was the guy that was in place in the moment. Jeroboam, in that respect, is no different than Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian Empire. He's not worshiping God. He's not loyal to God. He's not faithful to God, but God's going to use him anyway because it serves God's purpose. It's God's sovereignty in action. Exactly. Well, notice one other thing before we move on. Go back to verse 25 in 2 Kings chapter 14. We talk about Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who's from Gath-Hepher. Well, where is Gath-Hepher? It is in Israel. It is in the territory of Israel. But specifically, where is Gath-Hepher? Can you find it on a map? Well, Gath-Hepher, now I realize if you're watching online, you won't be able to see this clearly. Gath-Hepher is right here. On the map, this is the Sea of Galilee right here. Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Jerusalem is here, Shechem is here. Here's Gath-Hepher. Gath-Hepher is in the territory of Zebulun or Issachar, Kind of depends on where the border lies. It's about 7 or 8 miles west, southwest of the Sea of Galilee. Now, if you take your Bible and flip over to the map of Palestine in New Testament times, what do you find about 7 or 8 miles west, southwest of the Sea of Galilee in New Testament? Nazareth. Nazareth. In fact, Nazareth and Gath Hepher are basically 2 sides of the same hill. Nazareth is on the north side, Gath Hepher is on the south side. There's less than a mile difference between the 2 sites, basically. So it's for all practical purposes, it's Nazareth. Now, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Simply this. When Jesus is in the midst of his ministry, what allegation do the scribes and the Pharisees make about Jesus? I believe, if memory serves me, it's John chapter 9.
Can anything good come out of Nazareth?
Yeah, can anything good come out of Nazareth? More than that, they challenge the man, search out and see, no prophet comes from Galilee. Oh, really? Can you say Jonah? Now, they might have discounted Jonah because Jonah was a prophet to Israel, not Judah. Jonah was a prophet to the Assyrians, not Judah. But Jonah is still a prophet of God. So their contention was absolutely false because Jesus came from, for all practical purposes, Jesus grew up, wasn't born there, but he grew up in Jonah's hometown for all practical purposes. Came from the same territory. There are a number of very interesting similarities and coincidences, not really coincidences, between Jesus and Jonah. In fact, memory serves me, J.W. McGarvey wrote a book some 100+ years ago called Jesus and Jonah, where he lays out the similarities between the two. And that's a book well worth having. I didn't think to consult it before class tonight, but I do have a copy of it. So, Ahaziah is still king in Judah when Jeroboam becomes king in Israel. Jeroboam, though he does not worship God, or at least not exclusively, is advised by a prophet of God, Jonah, the son of Amittai from Gath Hepher, in his own territory. It's not like he's from Judah come to prophesy to him. And God gives Jeroboam success. The rest of the acts of Jeroboam, all that he did, his might, how he fought, how he restored Damascus and Hamath to Judah in Israel. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of Kings of Judah? Jeroboam slept with his fathers and the kings of Israel, and Zechariah, his son, reigned in his place. So we have several circumstances here where we have similarities of names. Joash or Jehoash in Israel, Joash or Jehoash in Judah. You have Ahaziah. Then you have Jeroboam, but this is the second Jeroboam. Come down into chapter 15 now, the 27th year of Jeroboam, the king of Israel. All right. So now we've ping-ponged back forward past the reign of Ahaziah. So Jeroboam now is king in Israel. Ahaziah is taken out of the way. And Azariah, his son, becomes king. 16 years old, reigns 52 years. You have several kings that have extraordinarily long reigns. Manasseh, Azariah, extraordinary. This guy would be how old? 16 when he began to reign, 52 years. He's 68 when he dies. For kings, that's a pretty good long life. Most of them didn't live that long. Did what was right, nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. Now, one of the things that we notice about Azariah right off the bat is that he begins to secure victories for his people. Azariah is also known by another name. Over in Chronicles, he's called Uzziah, Uzziah. And you'll find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. So Uzziah becomes king, Azariah. And he has some victories. He builds these towns, restores these territories, did what was right. Notice at verse 5 in 2 Chronicles 26, he set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him to prosper. There's a sermon in that, fellas. As long as you seek the Lord, you'll prosper. All right, let's examine that for just a moment. Let's think about that for just a moment. Jesus tells us about a beggar and a rich man. Who's the beggar? Lazarus. And what does Jesus tell us about the beggar Lazarus and the rich man? They both died the same night. What happened to the rich man? He's in torment. What about Lazarus? Not only is he in Abraham's bosom, but angels conveyed him there. If God prospers his people when they walk with him, how was Lazarus a beggar? If Lazarus is saved, if Lazarus is a righteous man and God prospers those who walk with him, what did it say here? As long as he walked with God, God prospered him. Talking about Azariah. How could Lazarus be a beggar? Jump over to John chapter 9, the man who was born blind. And in John chapter 9, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5, the disciples have a conversation with Jesus about this man that they can see. Some of them evidently know him. Who sinned that this man should be born blind? Was it his parents or was it something he did? And you think about the implication of that. Well, when could he have done something to deserve to be born blind? It would have had to have been in the womb. And Jesus, of course, says neither. He was born blind so that the power of God could be demonstrated. But that betrays the thinking of the common people in that era, and the thinking not just of the common people, but even of a lot of the scholars and scribes and Pharisees and chief priests. If you're a beggar, if you have some physical deformity, if some calamity befalls you, that's God punishing you for some kind of evil. Go back to the dawn of time, to the book of Job. And Job suffers all this calamity. He's one of the wise, wealthy, great men of the East. And then he loses his herds, he loses his flocks, he loses his camels, he loses his wealth, he loses his children, his servants by and large are slaughtered. His health is broken. Even his wife cut her some slack. She lost 10 children just like he did. Even his wife says, Job, just hang it up. Just curse God so he'll kill you and put you out of your misery. And what do his three friends, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, say when they come to reason with him?
Must have done something wrong.
You need to own up. You need to fess up whatever horrible sin you did to bring this on yourself. And the whole of the book of Job is this debate back and forth. I'm not perfect, but I didn't do anything to merit this. Yeah, you must have. Now come back over here to Amaziah or Azariah. As long as Uzziah or Azariah walks with God, God causes him to prosper. What about Lazarus, that beggar Jesus told us about?
The prosperity is spiritual, not
Okay,
physical.
there you go. Here is the point that I've been driving at with all this roundabout business. Prosperity with God is not measured in dollar signs. Now, God prospered Job, he was staggeringly wealthy even by modern standards. God prospered Lazarus, the beggar, even though he was hungry and sick in this world. Because when he died, he didn't die alone, did he? Angels carried him to Abraham's bosom. And he is in a place of peace and joy and comfort. The rich man who lived life to the fullest in this world, who by the standards and the estimation of those in the world, including the rulers of the Jews, must have been on God's good list, wakes up to find himself where? In torment, suffering. You had your good things in life. Your life was as good as it was ever going to get because you didn't walk with God. That was the best part of your life. Now you get the rest of it. Ahaziah was 16 when he began to reigned 52 years. His mother's name was Athaliah of Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Ahaziah had done, set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. So he goes out and makes war against the Philistines and the Arabians and the Meunites and the Ammonites, paid tribute to him. God gives him victory over neighboring nations, heathen nations, people that need to be in tribute to Judah. God gives him success. But in the meantime, there's Jeroboam to the north. Jeroboam is his neighbor. He did what was, go back to 2 Kings chapter 15. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but did not take away the high places. Well, that seems to have been a comparatively minor thing. The people still sacrificed and made offerings in the high places. And what do we discover about Azariah? He becomes a leper. How far into his reign did that take place? How long had he already been king when that takes place?
Where are you right now?
2 Kings chapter 15.
38.
Yeah. He was 16 when he became king. He reigned 52 years. Kings doesn't tell us, but he was king long enough before he became a leper that he had a son old enough to reign in his place by the time he became a leper. So he must have had at least 15, 20 years minimum of good going with God before this happens. Now come over to 2 Chronicles again for just a moment. In chapter 26, at verse 16, we begin to get more information about how he became a leper. When he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest went in after him. Now, wait a minute, jump back to chapter 15 in 2 Kings. What's this king's name? Azariah. Jump over here to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. The king's name is given as Ahaziah, but the priest, the high priest, is Azariah. You got a king and a priest with the same name. Azariah the priest went in after him with 80 priests of the Lord, men of valor. They withstood King Ahaziah and said to him, "It's not for you, Ahaziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary. You have done wrong. It will bring you no honor from the Lord God. Let's stop there for just a second before we even talk about why Uzziah would go in to offer incense or whatnot. Look at that statement. It will do you no honor. All right. Oh, we lost one coming back in. Here we go. It will do you no honor. How many people, how many otherwise religious people excuse what they want to do in religion by saying, but this is how I want to honor God. I feel God's pleasure, God's approval, whatever, when I do A, B, C, or X, Y, Z. Uzziah goes into the temple to burn incense. You would think maybe he would remember the example of King Saul in Second Samuel, or 1 Samuel chapter 13, rather. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, what had Saul done? He was ready to go to battle. He was waiting for Samuel to come to offer sacrifice. Samuel delayed. Saul went on and offered the sacrifice himself, and immediately Samuel comes and says, you shouldn't have done this. It's not your place. It's not what the Lord commanded. Here, Uzziah, or Azariah, the king, has gotten a case of the big head. His ego has gotten away from him. I'm the king. I can do whatever I want to do, and God should be pleased to accept this from the king. And Azariah, the priest, says, you're not allowed to do this. And the king responds with anger. David, when he was confronted face to face by Nathan, could easily have said, guards, get him out of here. But what did he say? I have sinned. Uzziah, Azariah the king, censer in his hand to offer incense, is told, you're not allowed to do that. You're not consecrated for this. And he became angry. This is when the leprosy comes on him. Leprosy broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priests in the house of the Lord by the altar of incense. Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they rushed him out quickly, and he himself hurried to go out because the Lord had struck him. King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death. And being a leper, oh, think about this, lived in a separate house, for he was excluded from the house of the Lord. And Jotham, his son, was over the king's household, governing the people of the land. So, Azariah the king, Uzziah, lets his ego get ahead of him. He begins to believe his own press. He has accomplished great things. God has given him victory over all these neighboring nations. He's a strong king. He's prospering. He's stable on his throne. The land is doing well. Why would he dare to want to do this? His ego got ahead of him. Rick?
Yeah, what I was going to ask is, do you think Satan may have, knowing that there wouldn't be a prophet, king, and a priest during that time, do you think Satan kind of get him to be jump that, knowing that Christ would be coming to get down the road?
Okay, interesting question from Rick. Is it possible that Satan, knowing that there would be a prophet who is priest, who is king coming, that is Christ, does Satan plant the seed of that idea that I can be all things in Uzziah's mind. Now, does the king understand that the Messiah to come will be prophet and priest and king? Probably not. So is he thinking of it in those terms? I doubt it. But is he thinking in terms of, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want, and that includes in the house of God? Apparently so. Because he has, in that moment, forgotten the Lord, taken the Lord off his throne and put himself in God's place. And so Jotham, his son, has to serve as his deputy, co-regent with him at this point. The rest of the acts of Uzziah, first to last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, wrote. Oh, this is interesting. Isaiah gives us some information about this over in Isaiah chapter 1, chapter 6. Isaiah gives us a little tidbit of information about him. And his record was written by Isaiah. Well, now that's interesting, because where does Isaiah spend most of his time as a prophet? No, he's not in Babylon. That's too early. Who does Isaiah primarily prophesy to?
Israel, right?
To Israel. Now, he does deal with Hezekiah, but a big part of Isaiah's prophecy is directed to Israel, not to Judah. Isaiah is that rare prophet who, in a manner of speaking, works both sides of the border. He prophesies to Israel and to Judah. At least he has interaction with Judah, chronicling the king here. Uzziah slept with his fathers. They buried him with his fathers in the burial field that belonged to the kings. They said he's a leper. They didn't put him in a vault, evidently, or at least not quite with everybody else. He's a leper, and Jotham becomes king in his place. Jotham is 25 and reigns 16 years, and he did what was right. Uzziah had been a good king as far as he went. He didn't go far enough. He had a strong army, but he decided to take on the role of priest. Now, why would he do that? We talked about ego, we talked about pride, we talked about arrogance. One thing we didn't talk about before we leave Azariah the king, Uzziah. One other thing to consider. In many of the pagan nations, the worship of idolatry, what did the kings there do? What did the kings of Israel do in their worship? It seems that they acted the role of priest for themselves at times. They had a high priest, but they acted in the role of priest themselves from time to time, it seems. Could that enter into Uzziah's actions? Think about the request of the people in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Give us a king so that we may be like the nations around us. That may have been part of it with King Uzziah as well. But this is a king usurping, taking on illegitimately a priest's work, and that's why he becomes a leper. And Jotham, his son, has to finish out the administrative part of his reign. He has to take his place. When he dies, then things change for the better, because Jotham has not made the mistakes of his father. He's seen his father's mistakes. Uzziah started good and ended poorly, at least in a physical sense. Jotham starts out better. Go ahead. Okay. Well, come then into 2 Kings chapter 15. We talked about Azariah or King Uzziah, and he just occupies a little piece of 2 Kings 15, much more over in 2 Chronicles. But notice what happens during the reign of Uzziah. We're going to come almost to the end of the existence of Israel as a kingdom. This gives us a date stamp of sorts here, because Samaria and the northern kingdom come to a screeching halt as a nation in 721 BC. We're down to the last kings of Israel here in chapter 15, not the last king, but the last few before they go into captivity. So you pick up here at verse 8 in 2 Kings chapter 15, we're introduced to Zechariah. In the 38th year of Uzziah or Azariah, king of Judah, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel. Reigned 6 months, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him and struck him down. He was assassinated, murdered. 6 months in, and he's murdered. The rest of the deeds of Zechariah, they're written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Notice, though, what's inserted in a parenthetical statement at verse 12. This was the promise of the Lord that he gave to Jehu. Your sons shall sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. And so it came to pass. Jehu has the longest dynasty of any king in Israel, if memory serves me. 4 generations. Out of 20-something kings total, 4 of them, father, son, father, son, father, son, and then they're cut off by assassination. Shallum reigns in Israel, verse 13, son of Jabesh, began to reign in the 39th year of Uzziah, king of Judah, reigned 1 month in Samaria. And Menachem, the son of Gadi, came up from Tirzah to Samaria and struck down Shallum and put him to death and reigned in his place. Shallum got not much of a claim to fame. He is a murderer. He reigns for a month and is himself murdered. Now it's interesting to notice where Menachem comes from. He came from Tirzah. Now Tirzah is right here, and Samaria, or what had been Shechem, is right there just a few miles away to the south. He came from the old capital to the new capital, just a few miles, and became king. At that time, Menachem sacked Tifsa, all who were in it, its territory from Tirzah on, because they did not open it to him. And notice what we learn about this man. When he sacked it, he ripped open all the women in it who were pregnant. We hear about the brutality of the Russians in Ukraine right now, and they've got nothing on Menachem here. We read this name as Menahem. In Hebrew, it's Menachem. If you remember the Camp David peace accords in the 40 years ago, in the days of Jimmy Carter, Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, made an agreement with Prime Minister Begin of modern day Israel. His first name is this name, Menachem. What is amazing to me, given what's said here about this man, why would any Jew name a child after him? Perhaps ignorance. Well, in the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Menachem began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 10 years. So he had a pretty decent run. We have an extremely violent man here. He has done tremendous violence just to become king and to take out his vengeance on those who had not supported him. The destruction of the unborn over in Amos chapter 1 and verse 13 and Hosea chapter 13 verse 16. That kind of violence is decried by those prophets. And what we read about him here is he's an evil man, an evil king. You look at verses 19 and 20. Now we see the Assyrians come to the fore. They have become the dominant power in the world. Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menachem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver to help him confirm his hold on the royal power. In other words, he bought off the Assyrians in exchange for them recognizing him as the legitimate king. This is the first invasion by the Assyrians. And that's significant because they'll be back. Now, Pul is the last king in Nineveh of Assyria. After him, the capital, for all practical purposes, is going to be moved to Babylon, even though it's still the Assyrian Empire. Now, one of the things we need to understand about the Assyrian Empire is that it was a coalition empire. It was not just the Assyrians. They vacuumed up people that they conquered and incorporated them into their empire. Others before them had done this, but not on the scale that the Assyrians would do, and not on the scale that the Babylonians would, especially after them. So, the Assyrians are to the north of the Babylonians. If you remember where Abraham originated, Ur of the Chaldees, back there in the book of Genesis. If this map extended, let me knock this off the board. If our little map on the wall over here were extended to show the whole of the Middle East, this is the western tail of the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent runs like this through Syria and Assyria and down through the Tigris and Euphrates valleys into what is modern day Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Iran, all that area that is where Abraham originated. The Assyrians, they're up here. But they have put the Babylonians, somewhat against their will, into their empire. Even in the ancient days, Babylon was recognized as basically the cradle of civilization. After all, where did God put the garden?
The Euphrates River.
Yeah, close to the Euphrates and the other rivers that existed at the time in that area. It was understood that Babylon was the cradle of civilization. This was an ancient people. The Assyrians wanted the legitimacy that came with incorporating this ancient people into their empire. And so they subsumed the Babylonian territory into their empire. But the interesting thing about it was how they described it and how they expressed it, because they presented this as a coalition, as a marriage between two great peoples. And in this marriage relationship, the Assyrians were the husband and Babylon was the wife. And you think about the patriarchal character of marriage in that day. Babylon is to be cherished and to be loved and to be honored. But Babylon is also to be what? Absolutely subservient and obedient, and you cater to our whims. Well, the Babylonians, that didn't sit well with them. They weren't in a place where they could do anything about it at this moment. They were their forces were part of the Assyrian Empire's army and so forth. They had their own king, but as we go forward, we'll see that the Assyrian rulers typically would take their firstborn sons and put them into Babylon as the local ruler for on-the-job training, basically. While the actual ruler, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, Shallum, so forth, would be out at the head of the army conquering more territory. Junior's back here learning how to be a king so that when it's his turn, he actually knows what he's doing. Well, it's at this point in the reign of Menachem in Israel that the Assyrians come calling. That tells us that they have overwhelmed or subsumed the Syrians up there just to the north in the mountains into their empire. They're expanding, they're growing at this point. This is in the days of Isaiah. This would be roughly 750 BC. And so Menachem buys off Pul of Assyria to give him some legitimacy. But he doesn't just pay for it out of his own treasure. Look at verse 20 in 2 Kings 16. Menachem exacted the money from Israel, from all the wealthy men, 50 shekels of silver from every man. Now, a shekel of silver is about not quite half an ounce, about 2/5 of an ounce, according to the footnote in this Bible. So that's quite a little bit. That's over a pound of silver apiece, basically. The king of Assyria turned back, did not stay in the land. The rest of the deeds of Menachem, they're in the book of the kings of Israel, slept with his fathers, and now we have a son reigning in his place, Pekahiah. In the 50th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekahiah, son of Menachem, began to reign over Israel in Samaria. Reigned 2 years. Well, now that's interesting because that means there's going to be change of government, going to be upheaval in Israel and Judah at the same time, in the same year. Because how long does Ahaziah, or rather Amaziah reign? You got 52 years. He lived 68 years total. So there's going to be some significant changes come along. Not Amaziah, Azariah, Ahaziah the king. Pekahiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just like his father, continued in idolatry. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself here. Pekahiah, in the 50th year, Pekahiah began to reign. He's evil too, did not turn away. And what happens to him? Well, he's assassinated. In verse 25 in 2 Kings chapter 15, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, his captain, conspired against him with 50 men of the people of Gilead and struck him down in Samaria in the citadel of the king's house with Argob and Arieh. And he put him to death and reigned in his place. So now we've got Pekah in his place. Pekahiah was evil. Pekah is evil. What happens here? Here come the Assyrians again. Now, notice verse 29. Pekah becomes king of Israel the same year that Ahaziah dies and Jotham becomes the sole ruler in Judah. Pekah did what was evil. And in the days of Pekah, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. So Pul has died. Tiglath-Pileser is now the king. It's Tiglath-Pileser who will begin to move the capital away from Nineveh Tiglath-Pileser comes and captures Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maacah and all of these other places, Kadesh, and all the land of Galilee and Naphtali, and he carried the people captive to Assyria. So here's the beginning of something interesting. Mark this down. We know that when Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem, against Judah, in 606 BC, there are going to be 3 stages to the deportation of the Israelites. In 606, Nebuchadnezzar is going to take away Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the children of the nobility, the children of the king and so forth, and put them into service in the Babylonian Empire as bureaucrats. He's going to educate them and train them and try to break down their Jewish identity and get them to identify as Babylonians. Of course, our good, faithful Jews maintain their Jewish identity while being faithful servants. But that's only the first deportation. In 597, because the ruler in Jerusalem is rebellious and stupid and ungodly, Nebuchadnezzar's army comes back and they begin to deport more Jews. And that would be the middle class, the tradesman class, the merchant class, and a lot of the priests, namely Ezekiel and his wife. And what we need to understand about these first 2 deportations from Judah is that these people are basically picked up bag and baggage and moved to Babylon and resettled there. They are allowed to purchase property in Babylon. They are allowed to live freely in Babylon. They are allowed to own farms and own businesses and ply their trades. They are not slaves in Babylon. They're simply relocated. They're deportees. It's not until the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, in the days of Zedekiah, that those who are captured then are marched away in chains to Babylon as slaves to be sold. The majority of their kinfolks that were already there, they're living freely. And it's entirely possible, maybe probable for that matter, that their own people could have purchased them when they got there, especially family members. Yeah.
So Jeremiah writes in 42 that all of them didn't go.
Right.
So how many people would you estimate in these 3 turning away actually ended up?
Okay, how many people from Judah were actually deported total, since there were some left? Well, you look at who Jeremiah says were left. They think of themselves as the cream of the crop. God has blessed us because we're so good. And Jeremiah tells them, no, God hasn't blessed you because you're so good. You're so poor, you're so pathetic, you're not worth the cost of freight to Nebuchadnezzar to ship you off to Babylon. That's who was left behind, the dregs of society, basically. How many were deported? I don't know a number, but it was the majority of the people over a 20-year period. Most of the people of Judah were removed, and only the people that basically had no monetary value were left behind. Now, we've just jumped 200 years into the future to get to Jerusalem and Judea and Nebuchadnezzar. What does that have to do with what we're talking about here? The conquest of Israel, likewise by the Assyrians, takes place in 3 stages over a period of several years. So we get down here to verse 29 in 2 Kings chapter 15, and here is the first stage of Israel's conquest by Assyria. And what does Assyria do? Tiglath-Pileser comes in and he takes away territory over here. He's already conquered this area, Manasseh and Gad and so forth. So now he's taking the northern territory, Galilee and so forth. And then he's going to come back. and destroy Samaria and remove basically all of Israel and reseed the land with pagan people conquered in another area. He's going to swap peoples, basically. Take the Israelites into Assyria and take people that he's conquered elsewhere and move them into the territory of Israel. And we'll get to that after the break. It's 1:15, time to take a break. Questions, comments, thoughts before we break?
These Israelites are like the Klingons in Star Trek.
How so?
In the Klingon culture and that whole world of Star Trek, the duty of any Klingon is to kill the king and become king.
Oh, okay. There is something of that, yes. Or so it seems to be. All right, we'll stop here and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes, which will. Let's get started again. We just had Pekah assassinate Pekahiah in 2 Kings chapter 15. We had the Assyrians come up and conquer the land of Galilee and Naphtali, the territory up there. And notice what happens now to Pekah. Get down here to verse 30. Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, struck him down, put him to death, and reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Ahaziah. The rest of the acts of Pekah are written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Here's you something interesting, something to mark down. Pardon me, I got something here. Something to mark down. Just sort of a curiosity note, an interesting note. Who is now king in Samaria, in Israel? Who takes Pekah's place? Hoshea. What does that name mean?
The same as Joshua, right?
Exactly. It's the same Hebrew name, same root as Joshua, as Hosea, the prophet, Oshea, and in the New Testament, Jesus, Savior. Most of the time, that name is a good name. In this case, not so good. So, Jotham becomes king in Judah during the second year of Pekah's reign. Now, Pekah doesn't last too awfully long. He lasts 20 years. 2 years in, Jotham becomes king in his own right, 25 years old, reigns 16 years, and he's a godly king. Jotham, on the whole, is a pretty good guy. Like his father, he left the high places intact. Now, you jump over to 2 Chronicles 27 for a minute, and notice there at verses 5 and 6, he fights with the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against them and subjugates these people, and they pay tribute. They gave him 100 talents of silver and 10,000 cores of wheat and 10,000 of barley, and paid him the same amount second year, the third year, and so forth. Now, question: why are there still Ammonites? You know, Ammon, Moab, kinfolks through Lot, but evil people. Go all the way back to the days of Moses. No, you can't go through our territory. Just like the Amalekites and the Edomites. These have been foes of God's people all these years. Why were they still there? Remember what God said when Israel stopped short in conquering the land of promise. I'll leave these people here as thorns in your side to see if you'll be faithful, basically, to test you and see if you'll walk with me. So We have these Ammonites being subjugated by Jotham. And that's basically his claim to fame. Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Israel make war against him. Look down here in 2 Kings chapter 15. You find the coalition between Rezin and Pekah. And notice what it says. The Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Judah. Well, how so? Why? Why would the Lord do that to him? Well, they weren't all that they should have been. This is almost the last mention that we'll find of Syria as an independent military power. The Assyrians at this point are going to exert such pressure on them that they will be consumed by the Assyrian Empire from this point forward. But the focus now shifts back. After Jotham dies, Ahaz, his son, reigns in his place. And in chapter 16, the focus shifts to Ahaz. Ahaz is a change of pace in Judah. We've had a couple of kings that were pretty good in a row. Ahaz is not even pretty good. He's not even a little bit good. In the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. 20 years old, and he's bad. In fact, he's going to set a new, I don't want to say high water mark, a new low water mark, you might say, for the conduct of the kings of Judah, because he's going to do things that not even the kings of Israel do. Follow down through chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. The parallel is 2 Chronicles chapter 28, starting at verse 5. But here in 2 Kings chapter 16, in verses 1 through 4, we learn A, he's an evil king. B, he's an idolatrous king. He worships not just run-of-the-mill idols, but he walks in the ways of the kings of Israel. Notice what it says in verse 3. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Now, typically when it says the high places were not removed, that's a reference to the people offering sacrifices to God there rather than at the temple. That's not authorized. God tolerated it. Big difference between something being permissible and something being tolerated. But here, when Ahaz offers sacrifices on the high places and the hills and every green tree, those are not sacrifices to God. That's rank idolatry. He worships idols, including Molech. And what does Molech demand? Molech demands human sacrifice, child sacrifice. And Ahaz goes along with it. What's wrong with this guy? Well, flip over to 2 Chronicles 28 for a minute. And you have a little more detail here. He made images for the Baals, made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering. He's basically reached out and embraced every kind of wickedness that he can find, that he can lay his hands on. And so you see in 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 5, the Lord his God gave him into the hand of the king of Syria, who defeated him and took captive a great number of the people and brought them to Damascus. He was also given into the hand of the king of Israel, who struck him with great force. Pekah, the son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 men of Judah in one day, all of them men of valor, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Zikri, a mighty man of Ephraim, killed Messiah, the king's son, and Azrikam, the commander of the palace, and Elkanah, the next in authority to the king. The men of Israel took captive 200,000 of their relatives, women, sons, and daughters, much spoil, and brought the spoil to Samaria. But a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded. And he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria and said to them, behold, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. And now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female, as your slaves. Have you not sins of your own against the Lord your God? Now hear me and send back the captives from your relatives whom you have taken, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. Certain chiefs also of the men of Ephraim, Azariah the son of Johanan, Berechiah the son of Meshillemoth, Yehizkiah the son of Shallum, Amasa the son of Hadley, stood up against those who were coming from the war and said to them, you shall not bring the captives in here. You purpose to bring upon us guilt against the Lord. Isn't this interesting to think? Even these people whose nation exists as an act of rebellion against the Lord, basically. Even these people whose nation is officially idolatrous, even these people know the Lord God. And they know what's right and what's wrong. And they look at this scenario and basically they're saying, we've done wrong by what we've done to Judah. We've gone way beyond what God authorized. God's going to take it out on us now if we don't undo this. Don't bring the captives in here. Our guilt is already great. There's fierce wrath against Israel. What does that tell us about the people in Israel?
They didn't obey God, but they knew what.
Okay, the nation doesn't obey God,
They knew what.
but there are still, even after they've run out the Levites, even after many of the faithful have departed to Judah years before, there are still people there who know the Lord, who know what's right, and who are acting as a brake, basically, on the unrighteousness of the nation. The armed men left the captives and the spoil before the princes in the assembly, verse 14. And the men who have been mentioned by name rose, took the captives with the spoil. They clothed those who were naked among them, gave them sandals, provided them food and drink, anointed them, carrying all the feeble on donkeys, brought them to their kinsfolk at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then they returned to Samaria. So what did they do? They returned the captives. They were not going to do what the Syrians and later the Assyrians and the Babylonians were doing. So come back over here to chapter 16 in 2 Kings. We got Ahaz on the throne. Reason comes and causes problems for him. And then you have the Israelites as well. But notice in this business with reason of Syria, 2 Kings 16, pick up at verse 6. At that time, Reason, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria, drove the men of Judah from Elath. Edomites came to Elath, and they dwell to this day. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Ahaz took silver and gold in the house of the Lord, treasures in the king's house, sent a present to the king of Assyria, and the king of Assyria listened to him, marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Reason. So Ahaz feels squeezed between the Syrians and the Israelites. He's fearful. He's evil, so he doesn't trust in God to deliver him. What had Amaziah done? Amaziah had feared, wanted to conquer the Edomites, hired a mercenary army. God sent him a prophet to correct that. This is an act of not trusting God. You don't need them. You can conquer these people without them. Send them home. He sent them home. He was victorious. Ahaz is not trusting God. So he's going to buy off the most powerful king he can find, who is Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. So he ransacks the temple, ransacks the palace, and buys off Tiglath-Pileser. Now, come and help me. You have a parallel in 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Syria, at this point, this area, Reason's empire or kingdom, is conquered by the Assyrians and assimilated into their empire. That's the impetus for that. Ahaz buying off Tiglath-Pileser to do this. Now, think about this. Ahaz is worried about Israel, who are bigger and more numerous, and Syria, who are bigger and more numerous. And so he appeals to the Assyrians, who are bigger than Israel and Syria put together. Where do Ahaz and Judah fall into this picture? They're a little piddly-sized kingdom comparatively. What he's doing, in a sense, is buying off Tiglath-Pileser to say, eat my kingdom last. Conquer us last. We're not important to you right now. Give us some breathing space. And here's a present to make it worth your while. But when you're dealing with the devil, and that's not to say Tiglath-Pileser is the devil, but rather Ahaz is not walking uprightly. When you're dealing with the devil, it's always going to come back to bite you. So, 2 Kings 16, verse 9, Syria falls to Assyria, and the Syrians are taken captive, carried away its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. And King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. Now, Ahaz, morally and spiritually, Ahaz is just not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He's ungodly. Travels to Damascus, way over here. And what does he see? Here's an altar for idolatry. And what does he do? He's going to copy it. Subjective religion sets its own rules, verses 10 through 18 here. He sees this altar. He has a pattern of it, a model exact in all its details, sends it back. Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that King Ahaz sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. When he arrived, he viewed the altar. The king drew near to the altar, went up on it, and burned his offering and his grain offering and his drink offering, and threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. The bronze altar that was before the Lord, he removed from the front of the house, from the place between his altar and the house of the Lord, put it on the north side of his altar. Commanded Uriah the priest, saying, on the great altar burn the morning offering and the evening grain offering and the king's offering and so forth. What's he doing? He's corrupting the use of the Lord's house for this idolatry from Damascus. Now, yeah, and he refers to it as the great altar, the big altar, the most important one. Now, why would he do this?
Tiglath-Pileser could have been requiring some of it.
Okay, it conceivably could have been a requirement by Tiglath-Pileser, but the scripture doesn't say that. But I think you're on the right track in a sense. He has sold himself to Tiglath-Pileser, to the Assyrian emperor. He bought the Assyrian intervention between himself and the Syrians in Israel. So now he owes Tiglath-Pileser. Tiglath-Pileser owns him. Go back and notice what he says when he sends him the present. I'm your son. You know, I'm honoring you. Whether Tiglath-Pileser required it or not, what he's doing basically is acknowledging the Assyrian emperor as his deliverer. So I'm going to worship his God. I'm going to stay on his good side. Well, he's already an evil man to start with, an idolater. He is the epitome of everything that Israel did wrong, except where is he? He's in Jerusalem. And he's going past everything that went on in Israel, even to the point of child sacrifice.
David,
Yeah.
it also seems that it indicates an extreme weakness in the leadership.
Oh, absolutely. He is a weak leader
Yeah.
from the standpoint that he is going to, if you'll pardon the expression, he's going to kiss up to whoever he thinks can benefit him in the real world, as folks would say, that is in the physical world. He's not taking account of his obligations, his responsibilities before God at all. In fact, he seems to be consciously going out of his way to ignore them and to offend God, to spite God. It's not enough that he imports a new altar, a new religion. He puts it right there in the temple grounds and then appropriates furniture of the temple and vessels of the temple for its use. And in the meantime, come down here to verses 14 through 18. What else does he do? He closes the doors of the temple. He basically puts a stop to the worship of the temple. If you look over to 2 Chronicles chapter 28, in verse 24, you'll read there, let me find the passage. 23, he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus that had defeated him, saying, because the gods of the kings of Syria helped them, I will sacrifice to them so that they may help me. But they were the ruin of him and all Israel. Ahaz gathered together all the vessels of the house of God, cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God, and shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. And he made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah, he made high places to make offerings to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his fathers. So we look at the overall view of Israel and Judah. The 10 tribes separate. God makes Jeroboam the promise, look, I'll establish your lineage, your family, just like David, if you'll just trust me. And what does Jeroboam do? Behold, Israel, your gods that brought you out of Egypt, Dan and Bethel, the golden calves, and anybody can be a priesthood and so forth. He's not going to trust God. He sets the pace for Israel to be idolatrous and lost. But then Judah comes along and raises up a king worse than the worst of Israel. It's just astonishing to even contemplate. Close the doors of the temple, basically shut down temple worship, as if to expel God from his own place. So you get down here in 2 Kings chapter 16, at the end of the chapter 19 and 20, the rest of the acts of Ahaz, written in the book, he slept with his fathers, buried with his fathers, and Hezekiah reigns in his stead. So here we go, ping pong ball again, from low to high to low to high, and now we're back up on top of things with a good king. Hezekiah reigns in his stead. But before we get to Hezekiah, in chapter 17, we're going to look back to the north again, to Israel and the reign of Hoshea. The interesting thing about Hoshea is that the first thing you learn about him, he's evil, but he's not as bad as some of the ones before him. He's the last king of Israel, and he's a bad man, but he's not as bad as some, which is, well, that's a backhanded compliment if ever there was one, isn't it? Not as evil as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. Now, Shalmaneser is also known in Hosea chapter 10, verse 14, as simply Shalman, and he's called Sargon by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 20 and verse 1. So we need to understand this guy, this Assyrian emperor, is known by 3 different names in the scriptures. If you look into archaeological history, you'll find other names associated with him as well, according to the languages that they're recorded in. But we've gone from Pul to Tiglath-Pileser and now to Shalmaneser. And at this point, Hoshea is going to be taken prisoner. Shalmaneser came up and made Hoshea his vassal. The king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. So Hoshea is taken prisoner. He had been playing footsie with the Egyptians. Now understand this, on the world stage, Egypt still aspires to be a major player. You've got Assyria to the north and east. You've got Egypt down here across the Sinai Peninsula to the south and west. Egypt is the mightiest nation in Africa at this point. Egypt's strength is their isolation, basically. They are so far from Assyria and Babylon and all of these rising empires over here to the east that it's just logistically not practical, really, for them, these empires, to come and try to invade Egypt. It's just too far. And so the Egyptians are relatively isolated, relatively safe. And of course, they're the biggest dog on the block, on that block. So what do they want to do to all the little kingdoms and nations around them? They want influence. Every big nation wants influence over little nations. It's always been that way in history. It always will be. So they want influence. And so they're whispering in Hoshea's ear, so to speak, we'll support you, we'll help you. Hoshea is trying to get them to reinforce him, except they have no reason to. They have no reason to risk anything against Assyria on Hoshea's behalf. Because what does he have to offer them? Other than what he could gather up in a year, he's broke. Because he's been paying tribute every year to Shalmaneser. The pattern of emperors, of invading, conquering emperors, was to impoverish these nations, not to the point of starvation, but simply to the point that they could not raise an army, they could not fight back, they couldn't bribe anybody else. What does he take? He takes money, he takes grain, he takes commodities. There's enough left for them to live on, but just to get by. They're not going to get wealthy, and they're not going to be able to stockpile enough to hire the Egyptians or anybody else to fight on their behalf. But the Egyptians, they want to meddle. And we're not done with them yet, because they're actually going to come up out of Egypt eventually to fight the Assyrians. Historically, it's called the Battle of Carchemish, and it is a major turning point in the balance of power in the ancient world. But we'll get to that later. So, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, carried away the Israelites to Assyria, placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So if you look at the map, and I realize I don't have a map here other than just this little one, we're taking the people from here, what we would think of as Galilee and the region of Manasseh and so forth, and carrying them through Syria, through Assyria up here, all the way over into the territory of the Medes, which is modern day Iran. We're going to move them, Shalmaneser is going to move them between 800 and 1,000 miles from home. These people are never going to return as a people to the promised land. Now, over the next couple of hundred years, they're going to be scattered all over the place. In the next 600 to 700 years, from the time of Shalmaneser's conquest to the time of Christ, Hebrew people are going to percolate throughout all of the ancient empires, so that by the time of Christ, in every major town in the Roman Empire, there's a community of Jews. Now, they're not all tribe of Judah Jews. They're Jews by virtue of religion. They're Hebrew people, but they're known by their religion. And so this is the beginning of that dispersal throughout the ancient world. From this point on, the majority of the descendants of Jacob will never live in the promised land again. Now, it's another 150 years roughly until Judah goes into captivity. But this is the beginning of the scattering of these people who previously had lived a really pretty isolated existence among their immediate neighbors. So, Shalmaneser takes them out and settles them in the territory of the Medes. That's roughly 800 to 1,000 miles east. This occurred, look at verse 7 in 2 Kings 17. This occurred because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God. That's it in a nutshell. They sinned against God. Now, he gives details. The God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, they walked in the customs of the nations that God had driven out. They did secretly, verse 9, against the Lord their God, things that were not right. There is an ironic statement, if ever there was one. And for those of you that preach or want to preach, here's your sermon. They did secretly against the Lord things that were not right. And yet, what does David point out in the Psalms? Where can I go that God can't see? None of this was secret to God. Jesus said, John tells us that men love the darkness more than the light because they're evil. Jesus came unto his own, and his own received him not. John tells us they were evil. They loved the darkness more than the light. Why do we hide in darkness? God still sees us. We think we can hide, but God knows everything. Notice he goes on for here in verse 9. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. And he gives just a catalog of all this. Come down to verse 13 in 2 Kings chapter 17. By the Lord, the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet, every seer, saying, what? Turn from your evil ways. Keep my commandments and my statutes. Live in accordance with all the law that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen. They were stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. Now, who are the fathers that he's talking about there?
The wilderness wanderers.
That's right. That goes all the way back to the slave generation that came out of Egypt, who did not believe and therefore died in the wilderness. They despised his statutes. Go down to verse 18 to summarize this. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Who's the king in Judah?
Lost count.
This is Ahaz. This is a bad, bad king in Judah. The worst of Judah's kings in many ways. Hoshea is conquered and taken into captivity. And all the prophets and all the seers have said it's because of this, and here's what you need to do about it. And they said it to Israel and Judah. And Ahaz watches Israel taken away. And how does he react? You look down here to verse 19. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. You would think, watching this happen, having a front row seat and hearing this is why it happened, you would think that Judah would sit up and say, oh, I think I'm going to do better. Nope, not going to happen. In Jeremiah chapter 24, Jeremiah talks about this, and he says, because of their unfaithfulness, God divorced Israel and married her sister, Judah. But then he goes on and says, and Judah turned out to be more of a whore than Israel had been. And that's why he sent Judah into captivity in Babylon. So, yes, sir.
What was kind of interesting just listening, with the war that we have going on right now,
Mm-hmm.
we got the Russians, Ukraine.
Yeah.
A lot of them don't want to fight each other.
Yeah.
But here in this scenario, I'm like, what's going on? Y'all both families, so why are you won't help?
Yeah.
You want to fight each other? I mean, that's
Well,
kind of hard to get kind of wrap your head around.
Okay.
And then
In the, for those of you online, Rick was making the point that in the current conflict in Europe, a lot of the Ukrainians and the Russians, they don't want to fight each other. The Russians particularly, they're not excited about fighting people that they consider basically kinfolks. And of course, that's Putin's contention, is we're all Russians, and the Ukrainians are saying, no, we're not. But they're not the ones that started the war. The Russians did, that Putin did. To make an application to the ancient world, Judah and King Ahaz are watching the Assyrians consume family. And they're just sitting on the sidelines saying, well, I'm glad that's not me. Why did they not get together? Why did they not support one another? Well, Think about their histories. They've been divided ever since the days of Solomon. They have been competitors ever since the days of Solomon. Now, the same God has been sending both of them prophets and seers with the same message: honor me, follow me, obey me, keep my commandments, and I'll bless you. And what are they both doing? Israel consistently, nope, 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 nope. And Judah, ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, depends on who's on the throne as to whether or not we're going to be faithful. Which tells you, by the way, where the hearts of a lot of the people in Judah were. Their hearts were not with God, because when they get a good king, it takes him his whole reign to turn things around. And then when he's followed by a bad king, they just nosedive right off into evil again. It seems like it doesn't take a week to get back to their bad ways. That tells you that a lot of the people really didn't have their hearts in it. They identified more with Israel. But why would they not stand with Israel? Well, you've heard the expression, there's no honor among thieves. These folks, in a sense, are thieves. They're looking out for themselves first and foremost. When you're not walking with God, who do you have to lean on? Just me. So they're taking care of themselves at the expense of their kinfolks. So we have the end of Israel here. Go back into the earlier verses. Hoshea is taken prisoner. Verses 7 through 18 in chapter 17, you have the sins of Israel laid out for us. What had they done? They had served false gods. They had refused to listen to the Lord's prophets. They had rejected his laws and his statutes. Notice verse 17, it says they sold themselves to do evil. And so God removed them. Verse 18, took them out of his sight. And then in verse 19, the sins of Judah mimic and surpass the sins of Israel. So pick up then at verse 20 here in 2 Kings chapter 17, and notice you have kind of a summary statement here that really covers the whole of both kingdoms in this scenario. You start at verse 20 and go down to verse 23. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. That would include Judah too, wouldn't it? And afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from out of his sight, as he'd spoken by all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. But guess what? Judgment's coming for Judah too. God's going to remove them as well. The difference being God will restore them, because he's not finished with them yet. You look down here to verse 24, the rest of the chapter. Here are the results of the captivity. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and Hamath and Sepharvaim and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. Samaria here stands for all of the land of Israel, all of the northern kingdom. At the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. Stop there for just a minute. The Lord sent lions, and the skeptic says, there are no lions in the Middle East. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, even in the 19th century, that's true. You don't find large predatory cats in the Middle East at all anymore. but you used to. The Asiatic lion, which is a relation of the traditional African lion with the big mane and everything, Asiatic lion, which is still found in the subcontinent of India, though its numbers are dwindling. The Asiatic lion used to cover all of India and all of the Middle East as far as the Mediterranean and down into Egypt. In fact, there are stelae, carvings of ancient kings of Babylon and Assyria hunting lions from chariots. They were driven extinct in ancient times, but they were still there up until after the 1st century, not as numerous, but in fact, they persisted in small numbers at least until the Middle Ages. The fact that they're not there now doesn't mean that they weren't there then.
They would have had to come that way once they debarked from the ark. I mean, they had to come down from Ararat, so.
But you think about it, yeah, here's the ark on Ararat. Where did all the lions in the world today come from? Well, they came from Noah.
Exotic animals are.
You turn them loose, some of them went that way and some of them went that way. Some of them went to India and some of them went to Africa.
But it says the Lord sent lions among them, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
even if there weren't lions there, he sent them.
Even if they weren't native, he sent them. But the point being, they were not an unusual animal in that ancient time for that area. It's a little bit like the cedars of Lebanon. You don't find great big timber-sized trees anywhere in that area anymore. But that doesn't mean that they weren't there once upon a time. That's where Solomon got timber for the temple and for his palace. God runs out of patience, removes his people. Shalmaneser puts these people in. They don't pay attention to God. Lions come among them. What's the point of God punishing these people who don't know anything about him? We know that God is not a local deity like they thought of their idols and their deities. Oh, ours is a God in the mountains and theirs is a God of the plains. That we know that that's not true of God. But these people are engaging in all the sins that God had just driven Israel out for doing, worshiping idols and sacrificing to non-existent deities. They're doing all the same things that the Canaanites that God drove out for Israel were doing. So how do they handle this? It was told to the king of Assyria, the nations you carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria don't know the law of the God of the land. He sent lions among them. They're killing them. And so what do? Well, send them a priest that knows about that God. One of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. What's the point? God is emphasizing that just because you've taken my people away, you haven't taken me away. God still rules. So in verses 29 through 34, they send this priest and he teaches these Gentiles about the Lord, and they feared the Lord, but they still served their own gods. Look at verses 35 through 39. Here's what God expected of Israel. Notice at verse 34, to this day, they do according to the former manner. This is talking about the people that were moved in there. They do not fear the Lord. They do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. the Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, you shall not fear other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall fear the Lord. Well, this is what the priest is supposed to be telling these people. This is what Israel was supposed to know. Here you have the reasons that God destroyed Israel stated. They didn't do these things. Well, these other people need to know this. Don't bow down to all this. The statutes, the rules, the law, the commandments that he wrote, you shall always be careful to do. Do not fear other gods. Do not forget the covenant that I made with you. Look down to verse 40. Speaking of Israel, they would not listen, but did according to their former manner. They persisted in their evil. So these nations feared the Lord and also served their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children and their fathers to this day. They adopt just enough knowledge of the Lord to not be out and out offensive to him in a sense. But they don't acknowledge him for who he is. God expected from Israel, be faithful, and they weren't. Those that took their place were no better.
Is that a commentary for us here today?
Could you make an application? Certainly. How many Christians in the world today basically divide their loyalty between the Lord and the ball field, or the Lord and the job, or the Lord and the vacation, or the Lord and my family that are living like heathens? Peter, 1 Peter chapter 1, quotes Moses, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch the unclean thing. Don't associate with unrighteousness. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we're at the point where Israel as a nation is no more. And we're about to enter into the last part of Judah's history. And rather than try to do that in the last 5 minutes, let me just sort of throw it open. Are there comments or questions before we conclude for the night? Folks online? Well, if you would, chapters 18 through 25 of 2 Kings, this is the last section of Hebrew history leading up to captivity. Bear in mind that we are now in the time of the major prophets. We've already mentioned Isaiah. We are coming up to the time of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, some of the minor prophets as well. We'll be trying to draw some of their writings and some of their statements and activities in as we go forward from here. Jeremiah particularly, and Daniel. But we'll get to that as we go along. Questions or comments? Well, you get about 5 minutes back tonight. Thank you for being here.
Good lesson.